And thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for paying such careful attention to this trial. And here we are today, 24 years, 1 month, 28 days after Detective Paul Ratzberg was called to the scene of what the evidence shows was the homicide of Julie Jensen. Now, last night in preparation for what I knew was going to be my rebuttal, I watched the opening statements. I watched them on YouTube of the opening statement by Carly McNeil and the opening statement by Mackenzie Renner. And then I just watched the closing argument by Mackenzie Renner and the closing argument by Jeremy Perry. And I was struck by this point in Mr. Perry's closing argument where he said, he didn't want you to be responding to emotional appeals that cloud the evidence. I wrote it down, just make sure I got it right. And I'm wondering, what could he be talking about? I mean, I watched Mackenzie Renner's opening statement, and I just watched her closing argument, and it was not an emotional appeal to cloud the evidence. If anything, it was a very clear-cut, detailed, and I'd say somewhat dispassionate recitation of what the evidence was going to show in her opening statement and what it did show in her closing argument. And I was struck by the extraordinary similarity between her opening statement and her closing argument. In fact, I would say they were identical. And there's a reason for that. It's because in between the two was the evidence that was presented to all of you, and it was presented to you in exactly the way that Carly McNeil told you it would be presented to you, and it was presented to you in exactly the way she said it was presented to you in her closing argument. So if we're talking about emotional appeals, emotional appeals that cloud the evidence, the first thing that came to my mind was the defense opening statement. In fact, the opening lines by Mackenzie Renner, where she spoke of, and I can't quite emulate the tone of voice that she used, but it was like a broken tone of voice, like a distraught mess of a man, eyes red from crying, snot bubbling up from his grief, had trouble standing up. Well, I guess that was an emotional appeal, but it didn't cloud the evidence. It was just pure fiction, because you never heard any evidence like that, did you? I know you didn't. I was sitting here in the courtroom with you. There was no evidence of anything like that. In fact, they asked Dave, I forgot Dave's last name, but the paramedic who responded, who's now an assistant chief, and they asked him, well, did you know anything about the defendant, Mark Jensen? No, I just was going there to take care of the victim. And so he described to you the scene, the victim, her condition. There was no evidence at all of this, the opening couple of paragraphs in the defense opening statement. And there were other things in the defense opening statement that simply were never, there was no evidence presented to you. When they had the opportunity to present their evidence to you, they didn't present any evidence of any other person besides Mark Jensen and at one point, Laura Koster, speaking of Julie being suicidal. DeFazio said she was not suicidal. Dr. Borman said she was did not appear suicidal. She was distraught. She was upset. There was no testimony from any witness here that Julie Jensen, that any other third-party lay witness had ever heard Julie Jensen talking about suicide. That was mentioned in their opening statement, but when they had the opportunity to prove that to you, to present evidence of that. They didn't, did they? And then they also, during the course of their part of the case, if there's something important that they want you to know, that's when they're supposed to bring it out. Now, in his closing argument, Mr. Renner referred to this as being, I'm sorry, Mr. Perry, not Mr. Renner. Mr. Perry referred to this home computer as the second home computer. Where did that come from? Another thing that was just made up out of whole cloth. They asked David Jensen, wasn't this the second home computer? He said, no, not that he remembered. There was simply no evidence of this being the second home computer. And remember, there was testimony about how common it was to have a home computer in a residence in 1998. It was very, very, very unusual. In fact, Detective Ratsberg said this is the first time they'd ever seized a computer from a residence in the course of an investigation. So the emotional appeal, I don't know, maybe he was thinking I was going to do it. Maybe he was talking about my cross-examination of these hired guns that the defense brought in. The $23,815 testimony from Dr. Lindsay Thomas. The $10,000 to $15,000 testimony from Dr. Stacy Hale. And, I don't know, the $10,000 plus testimony from Dr. West. Because I did cross-examine those witnesses, and perhaps that's when he was talking about emotional. But, you know, that was very directly connected to the evidence. Now, defense counsel also, in his closing argument, told you some things that the evidence just didn't support that proposition. Remember when he was talking to you about how the evidence showed that Mark Jensen could not possibly have been on the computer on December 2nd at 11:45 or 11:43 a.m.? And I'll ask Ms. McNeil if she could pull that up. Not his argument. We're not pulling up Mr. Perry's argument. We're pulling up the evidence about the use of the computer on December 2nd. And that evidence, when you see it come up, is going to show that the internet was used on the Jensen home computer at something in the neighborhood of 11:45 a.m. on November 2nd. He said, well, that's not possible. It's not possible that he could have been using the computer 11:45 a.m. or at whatever time it was because, he was picking up the prescription. Well, the evidence also showed when he picked up the prescription, and it was at 11:13 a.m. So first of all, here's the internet usage, and you can see 8:14 a.m. to 8:49 a.m. Well, he was saying, at 8:14 a.m. to 8:49 a.m., he was taking Douglas to preschool. Well, that's not true. There's no evidence that he was taking Douglas to the preschool at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m., and in fact, we know for a fact that he wasn't. You want to know how? We know that he was not taking Douglas to preschool at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. because there he is on the computer at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. And there's no evidence that Douglas was being transported to daycare at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. other than what Mr. Perry said to you in his closing argument, and that's not evidence. Opening statements and closing arguments are not evidence, and I guess there's a good reason for that when you consider the opening statement by Mackenzie Renner when she's talking about the defendant's distraught condition on the morning or in the afternoon when law enforcement responded to the scene of Julie Jensen's murder. And then we can bring up, do you have the receipt or the record of the pickup of Ambien? It was 11:13 to 11:14 a.m. She's looking for it. I can just tell you that's what it was, 11:13 to 11:14 a.m. Because I know the evidence in this case. Because it wasn't just Detective Ratsberg that responded on December 3rd, 1998. 24 years, 1 month, and 28 days ago. I was there too. You know, in his closing argument, Mr. Perry spent a good 40 to 50 minutes talking about Aaron Dillard and Ed Klug and talking about their credibility or his perception of their lack of credibility. But remember, when did they come into this case? In 2007. In 2007 is when Ed Klug and Aaron Dillard first came into this case. There's no indication the state had ever heard of either one of them before 2007. Yet when was this case issued? In March of 2002. So do you actually think the entire state's case hinges upon the testimony of two people we've never heard of, never seen? Obviously not. What do you suppose the evidence in this case actually does hinge upon? It hinges upon all this evidence that the defense counsel wants you to ignore. Now, there's been an unusual amount of discussion about penises, considering that this is a homicide case. But do you honestly think that we were talking about penises as a means by which to misdirect your attention away from the evil, unspeakably awful things that this man did to Julie Jensen? Do you really think that's the thing we wanted you to focus on? No. The reason that we talked about these penis photos and the astonishing collection and array of penis pictures on Mark Jensen's work computer that was recovered in 2002, it's not because we want to show you that he's got a strange and sick obsession with penises. It's because we wanted to show you that his strange and sick obsession with penises drove his behavior in the years of harassment of Julie Jensen. Now, think about what the defense theory of the case is here. That Perry Tarica, a man who you saw testify in this case, and a man who clearly loved Julie Jensen and described her to you as the finest, kindest woman he'd ever met. Now, did you get the impression that Perry Tarica's testimony was contrived? Or did you get the impression that Perry Tarica was telling you the God's honest truth about this woman that he loved? Do you honestly think, as you're sitting here right now, that any normally constituted human being, any normally constituted man, for 7 years after his girlfriend breaks up with him, for 7 years, he does hang-up call after hang-up call after hang-up call after hang-up call. For 7 years, he drops explicit pornographic photos off at the residence of Julie Jensen and at the office of Mark Jensen. Do you honestly believe that? That doesn't make any sense, does it? On the other hand, if you're dealing with a sadistic, narcissistic sociopath, which the evidence shows Mark Jensen is, then it makes perfect sense. Because you see, doing all these hang-up calls, the person that's doing it doesn't see the result. Dropping off these photos, the person that's receiving that, the person that's, Perry Tarica would not have seen the effect that it's having on Julie Jensen. The police saw it. The police saw how distraught and humiliated and embarrassed Julie Jensen was by this. And Mark Jensen saw it too. And Mark Jensen, when he'd get, as he put it, one of his few truthful statements to Detective Ratzberg, I mean, he told the truth in some instances to Detective Ratzberg. It was, as defense counsel referred to it, Mr. Perry referred to it in his closing argument. I wrote it down so I get it right. Blends facts with fiction. So who is blending facts with fiction? You know, part of this case, when you're looking at the way people were speaking about the case, and the way Mark Jensen was speaking about the case, you've got to look at the process in which this case unfolded. So when Mark Jensen was talking to Paul Ratzberg on April 21st, 1999, he'd never heard of Ed Klug. I mean, well, he'd heard of Ed Klug. He didn't know that we knew what Ed Klug was going to tell us. He didn't know that Ed Klug was going to come forward and tell the truth about that conversation on November 7th, 1998. So on April 21st, 1999, what Paul Ratzberg knew was pretty much only what Paul Ratzberg told him. Of course, in addition to what he did. So on April 21st, 1999, Mark Jensen knew how he killed Julie Jensen. And then he found out from Paul Ratzberg what we knew about how Julie Jensen died. So he was blending fact with fiction. He had to disclose what he knew that we were going to find out. David was there with him, so he had to disclose that David said, well, yeah, she couldn't get out of bed, or David said she couldn't talk. She could not talk on the morning of December 3rd. So Mark Jensen was telling the truth about Julie Jensen's condition on the morning of December 3rd because he had to. He had to, because David was there with him. So he had to tell that much of the truth. And he did not know that we were going to later prove that at 9:42 a.m., somebody was on the computer looking up antifreeze, ethylene glycol, and why isn't she dead yet? You know, what are the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning? He didn't know when he was talking to Paul Ratzberg on April 21st, 1999, that was information that Paul Ratzberg had already. And Paul Ratzberg didn't tell him that. So he told the truth. That on April 3rd, 1999, on December 3rd, 1998, on that morning, Julie couldn't get out of bed. He said it multiple times. Could you pull that up, Ms. McNeil? Answer, she couldn't get out of bed that morning. Answer, I mean, I'd hate to have it come to that, but you can ask David about Mom's condition that morning. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because Mom was sick. We did nothing, you know. There was no sexual thing going on that morning. And then later, well, she had to get up, get water. Answer, I brought it to her. Question, answer, she did not get out of bed. Question, so you did have some conversation. She asked you to get a glass of water. Answer, no, I got it for her. She had nothing to say. David, after that fact, I think she was giving me indications like nodding her head or something like that. But David said that she couldn't talk that morning. So you see, on April 21st, 1999, he was blending fact with fiction. So when he was confronted about Kelly Labonte, she's just, she's the secretary for Scott McQuay. Girlfriend, no, she's not my girlfriend. And then when he starts showing the emails, just, you mean that, Kelly? Oh, yes, well then, yes. Okay, now, yes, now, on April 21st, 1999, now, yes, you could say that. But even, it was very difficult to get a straight answer out of this guy who was blending fact with fiction. And do you think it's because he was too stupid to understand the question, or do you think he was smart enough not to answer it? Blending fact with fiction is Mark Jensen's pièce de résistance. It's his calling in life, to mix fact with fiction. So take the fact of Julie Jensen's one weekend affair with Perry Tarica in 1991, and then build the fiction around it, that Perry Tarica is doing all these hang-up phone calls, but that's not enough. Eventually he's got to make it better. He's got to make it more humiliating, because he's a sadist. He's sadistic. The evidence shows that he's sadistic. And what means did he have by which to perpetuate this sadistic plan that he had? Well, he had a seemingly endless array of penis photos on his computer, and a seemingly endless array of fellatio pictures on his computer. He had an endless stock of pornography that he could use to humiliate and demean Julie Jensen with for years and years and years. And that's the mark of a sadist, a controlling, manipulative sadist. And then you have Turtle. Turtle. It looked like an email from Turtle to Julie Jensen. That's the email that he showed her with these disgusting, revolting photos. And by the way, talk about somebody being bought and paid for. Consider the testimony of Dr. West. She wouldn't even acknowledge that, this 36-page record of harassment that was maintained by Julie Jensen at the request of a law enforcement officer, Dr. West could not even bring herself to acknowledge that that's a form of harassment or that's evidence of harassment. Couldn't even bring herself to acknowledge that Turtle to Julie email with those disgusting, revolting photos on it, she couldn't even bring herself then to agree that was harassment. So maybe I got a little bit upset with Dr. West, because I think when people get on the witness stand, they're supposed to tell the truth, no matter how much they're paid to disguise it. So Dr. West, with her lofty degrees and her forensic psychiatry specialization, and Siggy caps, and if you remember, Dr. Hale laughed at me when I said Sige caps. Well, I apologize to you, ladies and gentlemen. I mispronounced Siggy caps. But I knew what the first letter of Siggy caps was. It's an S. And what does it stand for? It stands for sleep. The very first thing, the Siggy caps, the very first thing for analyzing depression with a patient is to talk about sleep disorders. And don't you think that Dr. Borman, a board-certified family practitioner with years and years of experience, and he said many patients who came to him with depression. In fact, he talked about Siggy caps. So don't you think he talked about sleep? He did. He said he did. And he said he made no notes of any kind of sleep abnormality or sleep problems with Julie on either September 21st or on December 1st. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at his notes. Of course, good luck reading them, but you can consider his testimony. He never said anything about any sleep disorder. And yet, what did Dr. West say about Siggy caps? Oh, yes, Julie Jensen had a sleep problem. Well, where did that come from? Well, Dr. Borman's notes. Well, that was Dr. Borman's notes from December 2nd when he was talking to Mark Jensen. So it was Mark Jensen was the origin of her sleep disorder, not Julie Jensen, not Dr. Borman. It all came from Mark Jensen. But she just could not acknowledge, well, no, that came from Mark Jensen. No, she just couldn't say that. No, it was in Dr. Borman's notes, therefore it came from Dr. Borman, even though the evidence is absolutely, positively, unequivocally clear that all of that information about sleep problems came from Mark Jensen. And when did it come from Mark Jensen? Years and years and years after he'd been charged with this offense, because she interviewed Mark Jensen for 5 hours. And the other guy, Dr. Herzl Spiro, whom you didn't hear for, but she read his report, he'd interviewed him for 14 hours. Now, what do they teach in these psychiatry courses where you can become, where you get board certified as a forensic psychiatrist when you completely ignore the evidence? When you consider the prime suspect in a first-degree murder, that's the best source of information, most reliable source of information you're going to get about the condition of the victim in the months preceding her death? It's Mark Jensen and Laura Koster. And you saw Laura Koster. You heard Laura Koster testify. And you heard the testimony about what Laura Koster had truly actually said to Julie Jensen about a week and a half before she died. Because you heard Ted Voigt testify about it, and you heard Teresa Fazio testify about it. And what did Ted Voigt say? Ted Voigt indicated that Julie told him that Laura had told Julie, I lived with him for after Julie had shown him this Post-it note, Laura Coster told Julie, I lived with him for 18 years. You have no idea what he's capable of. Now, Laura Coster denies making that statement, but she didn't deny living with him for 18 years. So what had the ring of truth to it? And then Laura Coster denies calling Paul Ratzberg crying and upset sometime around December 4th or December 5th saying, I think my brother killed my best friend. Well, how many brothers did Laura Coster have? And how many best friends did she have? So didn't Detective Ratzberg's testimony have the ring of truth? You know, there's so many little things about this case. There are so many little things. Take Dave Nearing. Dave Nearing testified that Mark was complaining to him about how he wanted his computer back, his home computer back. And this is on a Friday afternoon. And Dave Nearing said, well, you know, you should be happy they didn't take your work computer. And what happened the following Monday? You remember what happened the following Monday? Dave Nearing comes to work, and Mark Jensen approaches him and says, oh, my computer's fried. I have to get a new computer. Now, at some years earlier, Dave Nearing also recounted a conversation when Mark Jensen indicated that you could fry a hard drive on a computer by putting a magnet over it. Now, defense counsel made much of that. You know, they were cross-examining Jason Ruffle. You can't destroy a computer that way, can you? Take a 4,500-pound computer or something. Yeah, well, it's not like we said that you can destroy a hard drive that way. Mark Jensen said it, so he was wrong. That's what he said. Because Dave Nearing has no motive to lie to you. Dave Nearing had no motive to lie to you about the time on December 3rd, 1998, when Mark Jensen said he was at work, and Dave Nearing said he wasn't, and Meredith Perez said he wasn't. The people that were at work who testified in this case on December 3rd said Mark Jensen was not there. I think Rose McGinnis said that too. Everybody that testified who was at work on December 3rd, 1998, in the Racine office of Stifel Nicholas said Mark Jensen was not there.